Welcome back to Labor in the Gilded Age. This is the second lecture in this series on labor in the United States. And I think last time we left off with the new organization, or somewhat new, the Knights of Labor, that managed to withstand the financial panic of 1873, unlike its rival competitor, the National Labor Union. And we're going to see that, as I said at the end of the last lecture, a huge increase in membership in the Knights of Labor from 10,000 members in 1879 up to 730,000 members in 1886, just a mere 7 years. And I guess the question that we want to ask, that I asked the last time, is why did the Knights of Labor in particular become so popular? And then what was the response of the American society in general to the Knights of Labor and to unions in general? So there are a couple of reasons, actually there are 5 or 6 reasons that I want to offer that maybe explain and help us understand the growth and rise of the Knights of Labor. And number one is the U.S. economy grew after the Great Depression of 1873. Unemployment dropped, wages rose, which gave workers an incentive to join unions in order to protect their wages and working conditions and fight for even better wages and working conditions. Number two, new union leadership. In 1879, a man named Terence Powderly took over the Knights of the Union, and he was called the Grand Master Workman. He was a very, very good organizer, and he was a very, very good speaker. So people were attracted, workers were attracted to this figure, which underscores the importance of leadership, and effective leadership means organization and being able to speak well. Number three, the Knights of Labor offered an attractive message of reform that they couched in a critique of laissez-faire capitalism. The union decried, that is, criticized. Okay, I'm back. Sorry for the interruption, but now there's a different screen here, and you can see now the reasons for success. The message of reform, as I say, a blistering critique of capitalism. The union, the Knights of Labor, attacked and exposed the aggressions of bankers, the corrupt practices of stockbrokers and corporations, and the union warned that the concentrations of wealth would lead to, quote, the degradation and pauperization, unquote, of the working masses. And that really means that millions of workers were at risk of being mistreated, becoming poor, and suffering the ill effects of poverty that Henry George pointed out in his essay, or the passage that we read, the effects of poverty being crime, violence, and ignorance. So the Knights were raising the alarm that laissez-faire capitalism was really going to harm society on many levels, not just economically. The Knights, in their platform and constitution, which we will read parts of, called for the abolition of wage slavery, and they called for a new form of cooperative production to replace laissez-faire social Darwinist capitalism. And cooperative production means that workers would in fact become part owners and share in the burdens and the rewards of capitalist businesses. The Knights of Labor also demanded equal pay for men and women. If you remember, we saw the great disparity and gap in pay, $7 to $9 a week for men, $1.56 a week for women. They demanded the 8-hour workday as opposed to the 10 to 14-hour workday that was commonplace. And they demanded the establishment of state bureaus of labor to track labor conditions and the operations of the large trusts. So here we see the state action coming back into play, and that's why that term is so important for us to understand. And they also lastly called for the elimination of child labor, something that they felt was also detrimental to the health and morals of society. The Knights also gained support by leading high-profile strikes against businesses and trusts. And in 1885, the Knights led a successful strike against the Wabash Railroad in Illinois. The rail line was owned by a man named Jay Gould, a ruthless but highly successful financier who invested in railroads and many other businesses. And he was once quoted as saying, and I quote, "I can pay one half the working class to kill the other half," end quote. Nice guy. So what was he saying? Well, he was saying essentially that he could cut the pay of existing workers because he knew that he could replace existing workers with new workers, immigrants, women, etc. Probably not so much women on the railroad, but immigrants for sure. And that there would ensue a war of attrition among the laboring class. Those that lost their jobs would be naturally unhappy with and angry at those that replace them. So Gould is setting up this, what we would today call class warfare. And that goes back to Karl Marx, a term that he used to describe how societies work. And how history works, even. So this idea of class warfare, with one class killing the other class, and that being the laboring class, while the rich sat back and watched almost as a spectator sport. So this is what I call social Darwinism on steroids. Yet Gould was hardly alone in his thinking at the time. Fifth point, unlike other craft and labor unions, the Knights of Labor were open to all workers, skilled and unskilled, women, African Americans, and immigrants. And it's important to understand that this was a time of great fear of immigrants, nativism, the rejection of other people from other parts of the world, their languages, their food, their religions. There was a great suspicion at this time. There was also a great deal of racism, separation of whites and African Americans in American society. So the Knights of Labor were able to use what we would call today a big tent approach. They were all inclusive, extremely democratic, and that kind of reflects those ideas of democracy. And so that's going to make them very, very successful. And lastly, the Knights of Labor were also a group of thousands of local unions that joined the Knights of Labor. So it was what was called a federated union. So local labor unions could still exist and do their things in their communities and etc. But the Knights of Labor gave them a national front, a national organization that they could tap into. One other thing I find interesting is that in 1882, the holiday that we now call Labor Day, that we celebrate at the beginning of September, that marks the beginning of a school year, so it's not necessarily something students enjoy, but certainly adult workers enjoy because it's a day off, a long weekend, was pioneered and created by the Knights of Labor in 1882, and then in 1894, then Democratic President Grover Cleveland, made that a holiday for federal workers, and then it later became a national holiday. So the Knights did have a lasting impact in terms of some of their critiques of capitalism, some of the plans that they put forth, the 8-hour working day, no child labor, men and women being treated and paid equally, something that we're still not there in 2015, over 120 years later. That's something we continue to talk about. So what was the response to labor unions? Well, we can begin to do that by looking at this event that we're going to call the Haymarket Affair. So while the Knights of Labor were successful in raising wages and attracting new workers, in 1886 there was this incident that occurred in Chicago, Illinois. And what happened was a group of angry workers had demonstrated and protested outside the McCormick Reaper factory in Chicago in early May. The next day, or the day after the first day of protests, another large group of workers rallied again to protest the actions of the McCormick Harvester Company, a large multinational corporation. Akin to the Caterpillar Corporation today. They make all the earth-moving equipment, if you don't know that. And what happened on this second day was a series of speeches were given. Those speeches tended to be radical, to call workers to take actions against the McCormick Company. And what happened was the city of Chicago organized a battalion of police, some 200 police officers, to move in and break up this demonstration. And that's what the police were doing. And you see this pictured above. And as the police arrived on the scene, a bomb exploded, which set off mass pandemonium and chaos. And some 7 police officers were killed. 4 workers were killed. And in the aftermath, 8 union organizers and anarchists were rounded up, put on trial, found guilty. 4 of them were executed. 1 of them committed suicide in jail. 3 of them were sentenced to life in prison. Later they would get out. And what came out of this was a reaction or response of the American people towards unions, because the Knights of Labor are going to bear the blame for this incident. And the New York Times, in fact, published an article following this event. And I quote the headline: "The villainous teachings of the anarchists bore bloody fruit in Chicago tonight." End quote. So the Knights of Labor, again, bearing blame for this, are going to be accused of villainous teachings and bloody fruit. So these are fairly harsh words of condemnation for the Knights of Labor, though there was no evidence linking the Knights of Labor to the Haymarket Affair. There never was, and there never was, and nobody's ever found any ever since. So it seemingly was the work of a lone individual, possibly. We just don't know at this point. The evidence never came to light. But the incident really brought attention, national attention, to unions and the Knights of Labor. And there was a conservative backlash. Big businesses organized, again, to deal more seriously and aggressively with labor unions by hiring private security firms and armies. They enlisted the help of state governments and the national government to help break up union activities, to break up union speeches and protests, and certainly strikes. And in this time period, there were some 37,000 strikes. So striking was a fairly common thing that the Knights of Labor had promoted. It was successful. But really, after the Haymarket Affair in 1886, we're going to see that a series of strikes in Chicago, the Pullman Railcar Factory, in Pittsburgh, the Homestead Steel Strike, are going to result in spectacular setbacks and failures for the Union, again because of this conservative backlash. And the last part of the conservative backlash is not only state governments and the national government, but the court system. So judges at all levels, and especially the Supreme Court, began to rule in favor of big business and began to promote the economic doctrine that we call laissez-faire social Darwinism. So that's going to really mark a negative down point in union activity in the United States. And what happens then in 1886 as a result of the Haymarket strike is the formation of a new union called the American Federation of Labor. And this union was going to be led by an equally talented organizer named Samuel Gompers. And he decided to take unionism in a different direction. He decided that really unions should exist only for male workers and male skilled workers that were American. So he is anti-immigrant, anti-African American, anti-women, anti-unskilled worker. You get the idea. So he's pro-American male skilled worker. And Gompers decided to reject the idea of going on strike. He decided that skilled workers really had some leverage and a leg up in negotiations with big companies because they had skills. So Gompers was able to effectively push for higher wages, shorter hours, and job security for his members. And again, that's going to be a small and smaller minority of the workers as unskilled labor became more and more prominent due to technology and the use of mechanization. And this is only men. So the question I guess we could ask at the end is, did workers win or did they lose? What do we make of the unions at this time period? Well, I think we can start with the negatives. Certainly workers experienced less freedom. After the Haymarket Affair, big corporations begin to organize and cooperate with government and the court systems to limit the freedoms, limit the ability to strike, limit the ability to organize for workers. And that was really a threat to their job security. It was a threat to their wages, a threat to their safety and their overall well-being. So there's a great deal of hostility towards unions that's going to hurt the plight of workers. However, there is a positive upside we need to also focus on and be aware of. That is the rise in wages from the time period 1860 to 1900, that 40-year period. We see wages rising by 50% for workers. So while workers' wages were cut and cut often, that is, the companies and trusts weren't sharing as much of the profit as they could with workers, workers were still making more money than they did in previous decades. So that's worth looking at. So, okay, workers and unions come out okay. With that extra money, workers could then become consumers. And we already talked about the beginnings and the development of a consumer market-based economy with the expansion of rail networks, with the invention and spread of department stores offering lots of products to people under one roof. The workers can then take their earnings and buy things such as clothing, bicycles, phonographs, which is going to give workers some relief from their monotonous and tedious jobs. So with that, I will leave you to think about the situation with regards to unions. Did workers do well or not? Thank you very much.